Good morning. I'm Laura. I'm the Timbercrest chaplain. If you're watching this, you probably know that already. But we can't meet today for visitation team. And so those of you who I know already are on visitation team will have a worksheet, not a worksheet, a handout coming to you, at least in your mailbox. It may not be to you yet, but I'm going to talk through that. We were going to have Deja Lung do a presentation on behaviors, which is a really interesting topic, and she's an expert at it. She's very good at it. She's one of our social services folks. But because we can't meet together, she had some ideas for things that she wanted to do with you in person. So we're going to have her do it another time. For today, I'm going to go through some expressions of grief and just it's kind of grief 101, some basics. Many of these things you'll already know or you will have experienced in your life, but it's a good reminder for us, or maybe you'll hear something that clarifies something for you. Again, I'm sad that we're not together because it would be great to have some discussion around this because of the knowledge that you all hold. So feel free to shoot me any questions or strike up a conversation about these things. That'd be great. Business stuff before I get started. If you're watching this because you just happen to have Channel 3 on, or you are interested in visitation team, let me know. Right now, the visitation team, those of you that have the lanyard name badges, you can come in the building even during outbreak time. All you have to do is come in and get tested, and the testing happens on Friday from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m. in the assembly room. So if you're getting tested once a week, like the employees are right now, you can still come in and visit folks. We ask that you visit in the green rooms. In our healthcare, there's a system of stoplight pictures on the door. Red is somebody who's been exposed to COVID. That's in our isolation wing. You won't see a red. Yellow is somebody who has been exposed to somebody with COVID. And so yellow requires a whole bunch of personal protective equipment and some training on all of that. So if you really want to go see somebody in a yellow room, come talk to me and I'll see what we can do to make that possible. But by and large, most of the rooms back there are going to be green. And so you can come and go in those. Reminder to make sure that you're using hand hygiene, particularly the hand sanitizer, as you enter the room and then again as you leave the room. Other business stuff. If you are not on the visitation team and would like to be on the visitation team, please let me know. It's we do it as we feel called to. So some people come many times and make a few visits, or some people come once and make a lot of visits when they're around. There are some folks who find a few people that they really connect with and they visit them. Some people just go around and see who's available and visit whoever is available. And we even have some people who prefer to be called when there is a particular acute need. So you can structure it any way you want to. This group is for support of one another and for us to just check in. It also gives you access to the census back there. And then we're also having some presentations by in-house experts about these various topics that are potentially relevant to you all who are doing visiting. Okay, I think that's all the business for now. I may think of something else later, but for now, we'll move on to grief and some topics in grief. So you'll have a handout coming to you that looks like this, 3 pages. I'm gonna read through it mostly and do maybe a little ad-libbing. Different people handle grief in different ways. I'm sure you will already know that, but it bears repeating because it's one of the primary understandings of grief is that all expressions are okay. All expressions are, there's permission to feel however you're feeling. And that's one of the things that can help grief not get stuck in people is having permission to be wherever they are. That said, there are some ways that grief can get stuck, and those can get destructive or disruptive. And we'll talk about those more later. But in general, as you're visiting people and as you're dealing with your own grief, permission is a really good place to start. So any of these can be expressions of grief, and I'll go through each one individually. There's denial, anger, sadness, withdrawal or depression, guilt, and acceptance. Now, these are pretty similar to the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross stages of grief. I could say more about that model. Those of you who know that really well, you'll notice that I didn't include bargaining because I think it is a part of the whole thing, but there are ways in which it fits into other kinds of expressions that I'm talking about. And then I included a couple others. Now, there's also work being done right now that moves us away from thinking of a stages model and more toward thinking of it being circular and a winding journey. And there's no particular order, and you may circle back. Folks may circle back on any of these. They may get stuck in any of these. And some people may, fly through certain stages and spend more time in others. And so thinking of them as more as expressions of grief rather than stages is helpful. So denial. Denial can actually be a verbal denial. It can also be a task focus or an obsessive focus on something else. In people with dementia, you may even see that they will completely forget what happened, or they will morph it into something else that's in their minds. Denial can also include shock or numbness, where maybe your head knows, but your heart and body sort of haven't caught up. Or you're just protected from some of the feelings. A good thing to know about denial is that denial is a coping mechanism. It's a defense mechanism. So you don't ever want to pull somebody out of denial. Sometimes people will edge themselves out of denial. So a dementia person may be forgetting it and then say, wait a minute, did they die? And that's the point at which they're ready to maybe explore outside of denial. If they go back into denial, don't pull them out. It's usually because they're protecting themselves. It's too big. It's too big to handle, so they're protecting themselves in that moment, and they'll handle it when they're ready to. So for you all, when you're dealing with people with dementia, you almost never want to mention a death of somebody. Even, a husband who's been long gone, it may be that day they feel like he's just gone to the store. So you'll find ways of sort of feeling out where they're at in that particular moment. And you'll know when they bring it up that they are ready to talk about it and that it's something they want to address. But denial is just as much in people without dementia. I say We often dose grief. It's too much for any of us to bear all at once. We can't eat it in one bite. We have to process it in little bits. And so we will dose it out for ourselves. And we each have our own ways of, distracting ourselves or finding a little bit of space. And that space is sometimes denial is that space. And it's just a little pocket of rest. It can be. Now, any of these expressions, if you get stuck in them, any of them, then they can develop into something that's unhealthy. Okay, another expression of grief is anger. Anger can be at the self, which can come in the realm of guilt, which we'll talk about later. Anger can be at God. They can even be angry at the loved one who died, which is a hard thing to express, especially if they really had a good relationship with the loved one. It can be really difficult to admit that I am angry with the person who died for leaving me. And anger can be at anybody nearby. So if anger is expressed in your direction, don't take it personally. It almost always is stemming from anger at the loss itself. So what you can do instead is experiment with acknowledging their anger, saying something like, "You're really angry right now," or this is making you very frustrated. And you may notice that I sort of put a little energy into the tone there. And that's because if somebody is very angry, they might, Marie, stop by. If somebody's very, I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Thank you for your patience. If they're saying this and this and this, and somebody comes back and says, "Wow, you're very angry today," that is a very calm tone of voice, but they may hear it as, "No, you didn't hear me," right? So sometimes putting extra energy into that, "Wow, you're angry," not to match their tone exactly, but to sort of mirror a little bit, can be helpful to people. The next expression is sadness. This is the one that we most often think of or expect, and people will sometimes expect it of themselves. You'll hear people say at funerals, "I haven't cried yet," expecting that they should have cried. Tears can be healing. And so if you can, and so if somebody is in sadness, if you can just sit and listen, that's very good. If you can put Kleenexes within their reach, sometimes it can be too much for people to actually hand them Kleenexes. Some people are concerned that they're a mess when they're crying, and if you hand them Kleenexes, they can interpret it as a reinforcement of that. But if you strategically put Kleenexes right where they can reach them, and then allow them to reach or not, you're getting some of my little chaplain tips. So now when you see me do them, you'll know. With sadness is the place where reminiscing can be very helpful. So if somebody is crying, a question like, "What were they like when they were younger?" Or "What do you most miss about them?" Or "What do you feel like you're going to carry with you of them?" Those are the places where the stories can come out, and the stories can very often be healing. Often you'll see a sort of flipping back in reminiscing between laughter and tears, and they'll be commingled. And that's the place where some healing and some acceptance can come sometimes. Another expression of grief is withdrawal or depression. This is what it sounds like. And in that expression, this can be really hard because it can feel powerless to the person who's trying to help. So some things you can do. One is to encourage connections with others who have lost loved ones, because grief is best understood by other people who have been through grief. It's one of those experiences you don't know. It's very hard to know from the outside. It's much more fully known from the inside. So encourage those connections, and especially connections with people who have lost the same loved one. Also, with withdrawal and depression, give grace and space for these without trying to make them better. Again, with the permission. And then you can gently nudge people toward activities as the person can tolerate. Always remember that when somebody's in that space of withdrawal and depression, it can take a lot of courage to re-engage. And sometimes there may even be some feelings of guilt or some fear around re-engaging. So patience is very important in withdrawal or depression. The other thing that's very important in withdrawal or depression, we'll talk about this more a little bit later, but making sure that you are attending to the body, because that's something that generally the person who is withdrawn is not going to do as well or as easily. So doubling down on things like drinking water and eating healthy food and getting exercise and maybe a hand massage or some sort of touch can be very helpful, because sometimes the body can be a way out of withdrawal and depression, caring for the body. Guilt is another expression of grief. This is often in the form of regrets about things done or not done, things said or not said. And sometimes it's very clear and logical, but very often it's not logical. It's something like, I left at 1 a.m. and then my mother died at 1:30 a.m. She was fine at 1 a.m. I thought it was okay for me to go home and rest, but I really wish that I had stayed that extra half hour, and going round and round about that. The impulse is to say, well, you didn't know, you couldn't have known, it just happened, it was fine, like it's not your fault. That's the impulse. But the problem is that these things are not logical or rational, they're heart. And so they're not going to be addressed by the logical rational. They're going to be addressed by the heart. So often what I do when somebody is circling around guilt is to ask questions like, what do you wish? What do you wish would have happened? I wish I would have been there. Why? Because I would have told her I loved her one more time. Okay. And then we can talk about that. The other thing that I often do is to say, to look for the longing that's underneath. You really wanted the best for your mom. You really wanted her to have companionship. You really loved her a lot. And so affirming the heart piece of that, not worrying about the logic piece of it. So listen carefully, remind the person that they are loved, and reminding them of their love for the person who died. And again, permission. And then acceptance. This is often thought of as the end of the grief process. Actually, there's an author taking Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's ideas and talking about the 6th stage of grief, which he talks about meaning making. I think acceptance and meaning making can go right hand in hand. And it's often thought of as the end of the grief process, but actually it may never come fully. And it also may be present at the very beginning. It may be present in bits and pieces all the way through. And something to remember that for folks in denial, speaking of the loss is a move toward acceptance. And for folks in anger or in guilt, sadness can be a move toward acceptance. Okay. Whew, I'm going on here. I'm going to fly through some of these other things. You've got it all in your handout. But in general, people can go in and out of any of these expressions in any order. They often circle through them many times over weeks, months, years. The most important thing being with somebody who is grieving is to try to meet them exactly where they are. Give them permission to be exactly how they need to be. People with dementia, and sometimes others, traumatic brain injuries, or even just people in the midst of trauma, may talk in symbols. And so somebody may be stuck in talking about the tiling of a floor. I once had a woman whose husband was dying, and she was talking about retiling the floor and how hard of a decision that was going to be. And she was tearful about talking about this. And I noticed that this was a way of her talking about, a gentle way of her talking about how very difficult it was going to be without her spouse. So in those kinds of things, listen for the feelings underneath the spoken words and affirm the feelings. Grief can also manifest physically. Here's a whole bucket list, or a whole list of restlessness, insomnia, fatigue, decreased cognitive ability, memory lapses. People talk about baby brain. I talk about grief brain. It's very different in some ways, but in some ways it's when you're in the midst of grief, your brain works differently. GI symptoms, breathlessness, heart symptoms, headaches, muscle tension, loss of appetite or increased appetite. Taking care of physical needs becomes difficult and extra important in the midst of grief. And then also a thing to know, physical symptoms can happen around triggers or anniversaries without the person being consciously aware of their connection to the grief. I once had a gentleman who landed in the hospital every year at about the same time. I looked it up, and it was right around the time when his wife had died. He didn't connect that. The nursing didn't connect that. But his physical symptoms were at least in part related to the anniversary reactions of his grief. So some things to try. Listen. Fewer words are usually better. That's pretty often true, but especially true in grief. Affirm the feelings. Don't try to fix. Looking at pictures can be really helpful. Getting them to tell you a story about the loved one can be really helpful. You can tell your own stories about the loved one if you know the person. Physical touch where possible, or tactile reminders of love. So perhaps there is a particular blanket or chair that's associated with that person. Maybe that's a comforting thing. Or a pillow or a shirt. Hand massage, I'm mentioning this again, but things like that can be helpful. Music can be a very comforting space. Mostly give permission and be patient. And then if the person wants to walk, they should walk. I'm talking about in healthcare. You'll want to, if you're visiting in healthcare and somebody wants to walk, you might want to ask the nurse sort of what they need in order to walk. Some of them need somebody with them to walk with them. But if they want to walk, walking is good. Exercise is important in healing. And same with going outside. Ask the nurses, but nature is very important in grief. So some things that can cause grief in residence. Now we think of grief as being over somebody who is a loved one who has died. But here are some lists of things that can cause grief that people around here very often deal with. Loss of relationship. This can include death of family members or friends. It can also include conflict or decline in a loved one, or a role adjustment. For example, when an adult child needs to become a caregiver, or when a spouse needs to become a caregiver. Folks can have grief over loss of independence. So use of assistive devices like a cane or a walker. Bet you didn't think about that, but that's grief. When somebody's no longer able to drive, grief. When somebody's selling a house, if it's connected to a loss of independence. There's also a loss of identity. Somebody is no longer able to play piano or do woodworking or read. Somebody is getting a new diagnosis. That may mean that their dreams or expectations or their sense of self has changed. There can be grief around that. Also grief around downsizing or selling a house, because those things are often, if I sell my farm, I am no longer a farmer. If I sell my skis that I never used, if I give away my skis that I never used, then I give away the idea that I could learn to ski. Another is loss of familiar environment. So moves can cause grief. And then also a loss of functioning. So things like incontinence or falls or tremors or memory loss. Those things can also cause grief. So you may have seen some of those ways that those are playing out in your lives or in the lives of people around you. And you know how prevalent those things are in this place. And so part of why this is so important to know about grief is that so much of aging has to do with dealing with loss and finding ways through many different kinds of griefs. Big, little, running the gamut. Okay, so now on to types of grief. And again, I'm going to fly through this. You have it on your handout. Anticipatory grief is a grief that comes before the loss. So somebody knows that somebody is dying. They might start to have grief right then. Can happen with, for example, a family of a person with Alzheimer's may start to grieve the loss while the person is still alive. That can be complicated and hard to acknowledge because the person is still alive. There's this conflicting, I should just be happy because I get to spend time with my loved one. But, and it may include some guilt or confusion about having those feelings. Delayed grief is when grief is not expressed or felt until long after the event. For example, I had somebody who just could not get over the death of their dog. It just sent them into a really dark place. And they were confused about it because, they loved their dog, but they didn't think that it was that. They didn't expect this level of grief. We delved into it. And what the person discovered was that a lot of the grief about her mother dying a few years back she hadn't had a chance to express it. And now it was coming up connected to the loss of her dog. So every grief that we experience can be connected to every other grief that we've experienced. It's not uncommon for somebody to lose a friend and to begin to talk about, again, how hard it was for them to lose their husband or wife. Complicated grief. Complicated grief comes when there are complicated elements of the relationship or the loss. For example, a grief over an estranged father, or a grief over a suicide, which brings up a lot of complicated emotions. Grief when the person died in the midst of a ruptured relationship or argument. They have a yelling match as she walks out the house, and then she dies in a car accident. It can be complicated grief. Disenfranchised grief is when the person does not or cannot get social support around the loss. The person, for some reason, doesn't feel they have permission to grieve openly. This is why permission is so important. Disenfranchised grief can cause a lot of stuckness and a lot of destructiveness. That's one of the kinds of grief that we see causing addiction or depression. Sort of acknowledging it and expressing it is important. So you see disenfranchised grief over things like grief over a miscarriage, although that's starting to be talked about more, but still disenfranchised. Grief over loss of a pet. Maybe it feels like I shouldn't grieve this much over my dog. It's just a dog. But that can be very difficult grief. Loss of a relationship that was not publicly known, or loss of an ex-spouse. You can probably think of many other things. Disenfranchised grief can also come in someone who just doesn't feel like it's okay to express negative emotions. Cumulative grief. That is when multiple losses happen in a short amount of time, and there's not space to process one before the next one comes. Now that can happen when multiple family members die within a few months, family or friends die within a few months of each other, which again happens fairly frequently around here. But then here's another example. Let's say a spouse dies, which is the first grief, which means that the person moves to a nursing home, which is a second grief over loss of familiar settings. And then they have to sell the family home, which is a third grief. And then they have to give away the family pet, which is a fourth grief. And they move away from friends, which is a fifth grief. So you can pretty easily have a bunch of different griefs that pile on top of each other. It takes intention and support and time for that pile of griefs to be untangled and processed. This kind of grief is sometimes experienced by healthcare workers also. And so for you who are visiting, pay attention to your healthcare workers too. Another type of grief is traumatic grief, and that's when the loss has an element of tragedy or violence. So I knew a mother who watched her son have a fatal seizure and could not do anything about it. A loss due to homicide or terrorism or a traumatic car accident can be, or any traumatic accident. And in this kind of grief, the trauma needs addressed alongside the grief. And then there is collective grief, and that's when a whole culture, country, or group of people experience a loss. For example, wars, pandemic, natural disasters, celebrity death, or something like a school shooting, where the ripples are felt throughout an entire culture. And then there is what we call normal grief, which I say is a unicorn. Normal grief is very rarely normal. Almost always it has some of this other type of grief, anticipatory or complicated or delayed or traumatic or disenfranchised or cumulative or collective. I mean, almost always it has other elements to it. So continuing to say permission is huge, patience is huge, just simply listening and asking good questions and being there with the person. We'll spend a little time. Hopefully we'll be together in October. It's the end of my presentation here. And we can maybe spend a little time talking about this piece of it again, if you'd like to. just if you had thoughts. I'm also happy for you to shoot me some thoughts or start up a conversation with me or others. Thank you so much for continuing to visit. The census is coming out in the mail, so you'll get that. And our next meeting is going to be a week later because I will be gone during the normal meeting time. So we'll do it I think it's the 28th of October. That's on your invitation list. If you have, in the meantime, any need for support, any questions, please let me know. I'm always here, and I value the work that you do, and I know that it can be very joyful and very fulfilling, and it can be challenging, and it can stir up stuff in ourselves. So any way that I can help you, please let me know. And you all are in my prayers. Take care. Thanks for tuning in. Have a good day.